Captain Mike Harrison had been fighting fires for 18 years, and in all that time, he'd never believed in anything beyond what he could see and touch. God, miracles, divine intervention, all nonsense to him. Fire was science, heat, oxygen, fuel. Prayer was just desperate people talking to empty air. But on the night of October 15th, everything he thought he knew about reality would shatter in the space of 3 minutes. The call came in at 11:47 p.m. Massive house fire on Maple Street. The entire neighborhood was ablaze, 7 houses engulfed in flames that reached 40 feet into the night sky. Mike had seen fires before, but nothing like this. The wind was howling at 30 miles per hour, feeding the flames like a giant. Bellows dot as Mike's truck rounded the corner. He saw something that made his blood run cold. The fire had created what firefighters call a firestorm, a wall of flame moving like a living creature, consuming everything in its path. Houses were exploding. Cars were melting. The heat was so intense that streetlights were bending like flowers. Jesus Christ, whispered Jimmy, his partner of 8 years. Don't start with that religious crap, Mike snapped, checking his oxygen tank. We've got work to do. But as they got closer, Mike saw something that didn't make sense. Right in the middle of the inferno, surrounded by 7 burning houses, stood one small white house. Not a single flame touched it, not even smoke. While houses on both sides were reduced to ash and twisted metal, this one house sat there like it was protected by an invisible shield. What the hell? Mike muttered, squinting through the smoke. The fire chief's voice crackled over the radio. All units. We have civilians trapped in the White House on Maple Street. Repeat, civilians trapped. Mike's heart sank. That house might not be burning, but it was surrounded by a wall of fire. No way to get in, no way to get out. Whoever was inside was going to die, and there was nothing he could do about it. As they set up their equipment, Mike noticed something else strange. The other firefighters were staring at the White House with expressions he'd never seen before. Wonder, fear, something that looked almost like reverence. Sarge, called out Rodriguez, a rookie who'd been on the force for 6 months. How? Is that house not burning? Shut up and do your job, Mike barked, but privately, he was asking himself the same question. The wind shifted, and suddenly, Mike could see through the smoke to the front yard of the White House. There, on the porch, sat an elderly woman in a rocking chair. Her lips were moving, but Mike couldn't hear what she was saying over the roar of the flames. Is she insane? Jimmy shouted. She's sitting outside while the world burns around her. Mike grabbed his binoculars. The woman's eyes were closed, her hands folded in her lap. Her mouth was moving in a steady rhythm. And around her, the fire raged like a caged animal, but it couldn't touch her. She's praying, whispered Rodriguez. She's going to die, Mike said flatly, and we can't reach her. But as the minutes passed, something impossible began to happen. The fire started to slow down, not everywhere, just around the White House. The flames that had been reaching toward the sky began to pull back, like they were being held by invisible hands. Mike had seen a lot of things in 18 years. He'd seen fire jump rivers. He'd seen it climb buildings like a living thing, but he'd never seen fire retreat for no reason. Chief, he radioed, what's the wind speed? 35 miles per hour, gusting to 40. Why? Mike stared at the White House. The trees around it weren't even swaying, no reason. 20 minutes into the fire, Mike noticed something else. The elderly woman had been joined by others. A middle-aged man who looked like he might be her son. A young woman with a baby in her arms, 3 small children. They were all sitting on the porch, and they were all praying. How many people are in that house? Mike asked Rodriguez. Dispatch said 5, but I count 8. Mike counted again. 8 people sitting calmly on a porch, surrounded by the worst fire he'd ever seen. And not one of them looked afraid. The fire chief appeared beside him. "Harrison, I need you to tell me what you're seeing, sir. That house, how is it not burning?" Mike had known Chief Patterson for 12 years. The man was tough as nails, practical as a hammer. He'd never heard him ask a question like that. "I don't know, sir. The wind sensors are showing 40-mile-per-hour winds everywhere except around that house. The temperature gauges are reading 2,000 degrees 10 feet away, but normal temperature at the house itself. Our equipment is malfunctioning, or... What, sir?" Chief Patterson was quiet for a long moment. "Or we're witnessing something that doesn't fit in our training manual." Mike felt something cold in his stomach. He'd built his entire worldview on the idea that everything had a logical explanation. Fire burned, wind blew. Physics worked the same way everywhere. But this... "Sir, we need to get those people out of there." Asterisk. "How? The entire block is surrounded." "By fire. We can't get a truck within 300 feet. Mike looked at the White House again. The elderly woman was still praying, but now she was holding something in her hands. A small, worn book. Even from this distance, Mike could see her lips moving steadily, rhythmically. "What's she doing?" he asked Rodriguez. "Praying the rosary, I think." "My grandmother used to do that." "The what?" "It's a Catholic prayer. You repeat it over and over." Mike felt a strange sensation, like the ground was shifting under his feet. "What kind of prayer?" "About protection. About Mary, the mother of Jesus. About miracles." The word miracles hit Mike like a physical blow. He'd spent his entire adult life proving that miracles didn't exist. Every miracle he'd ever investigated had a logical explanation. People survived car crashes because of seatbelts, not angels. Buildings stood up in earthquakes because of engineering, not divine intervention. But this... "Rodriguez, get me the thermal imaging camera." The thermal camera showed what Mike's eyes couldn't accept. The White House was surrounded by temperatures hot enough to melt steel. The asphalt around it was literally on fire. But the house itself showed normal temperatures. Room temperature. "This is impossible," Mike whispered. "Is it?" Rodriguez asked quietly. Mike spun around. "What did you say?" "I said, is it impossible? Or are we just seeing something we don't understand? Everything has an explanation, does it?" Mike felt his world tilting. He'd been so certain. So absolutely certain that the universe operated according to rules he understood. But standing there, watching 8 people sit calmly in the middle of an inferno, he felt that certainty cracking like ice. 30-5 minutes into the fire, something even more impossible happened. The flames began to die down. Not because the fire department was winning. They hadn't been able to get close enough to fight it effectively. The fire was just stopping. "Chief," came Rodriguez's voice over the radio. "The fire is retreating from the White House." "Repeat that." "The fire is moving away from the White House. It's like it's being pushed back." Mike watched through his binoculars as the elderly woman stood up from her rocking chair. She was still holding the small book, still praying. But now she was walking toward the edge of her property, toward the wall of fire that had been surrounding her house. "She's going to die," Mike breathed. Asterisk, but as the woman approached the flames, something impossible happened. The fire parted. Like a curtain being pulled back, the flames separated, creating a path wide enough for a person to walk through. "No," Mike whispered. "No, no, no. That's not how fire works." But the woman kept walking. Step by step she walked through the flames, and they moved away from her like she was carrying some kind of invisible shield. "Mike," Jimmy's voice was shaking. "Mike, are you seeing this?" Mike couldn't answer. His entire worldview was collapsing. Everything he'd believed about reality, about science, about the impossibility of the supernatural, was crumbling like a house of cards. The woman reached the edge of the fire line where Mike's truck was parked. She was maybe 70 years old, with silver hair and kind eyes. She looked directly at Mike and smiled. "Captain Harrison," she said, and her voice was calm as a summer morning. "How do you know my name? I've been praying for you specifically. For 3 years." Mike felt the world spin. "What?" "Ever since my granddaughter told me about the angry firefighter who didn't believe in God. She said you were a good man who'd lost his faith." "I never had faith to lose," the woman smiled. "Everyone has faith, Captain. The question is what you put your faith in." Mike looked back at the White House. The other 7 people were still there, still safe, still praying. The fire was continuing to retreat, pulling back like a tide. Asterisk. "How?" he whispered. "I prayed Psalm 91, the woman said simply. "The prayer of protection. He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God, in whom I trust." That's just words. Are they? Mike looked around. The fire that had been raging for 45 minutes was now retreating on all sides. Not because of anything the fire department had done. It was just leaving. "What's your name?" Mike asked. "Margaret O'Brien. But everyone calls me Maggie." "Maggie, I need you to explain to me what just happened." Maggie reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, worn rosary. "I've been praying this prayer every day for 60 years. Today, I prayed it for protection. Not just for my family, but for all the firefighters who would risk their lives too. Save us. Prayer doesn't stop fire, doesn't it?" Mike looked back at the White House. The fire was now completely gone from around it. The other houses were still burning, but controllably now. His crew was moving in to finish the job. "I prayed specifically for you, Captain Harrison. I prayed that you would see something today that would change your heart." "Change my heart?" "My granddaughter, Sarah Rodriguez, has been worried about you." Mike's blood went cold. "Rodriguez? Jimmy Rodriguez is your granddaughter? She said you were the best firefighter she'd ever worked with, but you were angry. Angry at God, angry at the world, angry at the idea that there might be something bigger than yourself." Mike looked over at Rodriguez, who was coiling hoses 50 feet away. She caught his eye and nodded slightly. "She set this up. She prayed. I prayed. We prayed together. We asked God to show you something that would be impossible to explain away." Mike felt like he was drowning. "Are you telling me that that God ... that this whole thing was arranged?" "I'm telling you that God loves you, Captain Harrison. And sometimes, when we're too stubborn to listen to whispers, He has to shout." Mike looked around at the devastation. 7 houses destroyed. Millions of dollars in damage. People lost their homes. No one was hurt. Everyone got out safely. The insurance will cover the rebuilding. But you saw something tonight that you'll never be able to explain away. Mike's hands were shaking. "This is impossible." "Is it? Or is it just bigger than what you thought was possible?" For the first time in 18 years, Mike Harrison didn't have an answer. Maggie took his hand. "Would you like to pray with me?" "I don't know how." "Just repeat after me. Lord, I don't understand what I saw tonight, but I know it was beyond anything I can explain. If you're real, if you're there, help me to understand." Mike looked at the White House one more time. 8 people had sat calmly in the middle of an inferno and lived to tell about it. Fire had retreated like it was alive. The laws of physics had bent like they were made of rubber. "Lord," Mike whispered, "I don't understand what I saw tonight, but I know it was beyond anything I can explain. If you're real, if you're there, help me to understand." As the words left his mouth, Mike felt something he'd never experienced before. A sense of peace. A feeling that the universe was bigger and more mysterious and more wonderful than he'd ever imagined. "What happens now?" he asked. Maggie smiled. "Now you start asking different questions. Instead of how can I explain this away, You start asking, what is God trying to show me? 6 months later, Mike Harrison was baptized at St. Mary's Catholic Church. The priest who performed the ceremony was Father Rodriguez, Jimmy's uncle. The entire fire department was there, along with Maggie O'Brien and her family. In his testimony that day, Mike said, "I spent 18 years fighting fires and believing that everything could be explained by science. Then I met a woman who fought fire with prayer and won. I realized that the real fire wasn't the one burning the houses. It was the one burning in my heart, the anger and emptiness that came from believing I was alone in the universe." That night, God put out both fires. Mike still fights fires, but now he carries a small rosary in his pocket, and before every call, he says a prayer for protection, not just for himself, but for everyone he's sworn to serve. And sometimes, on quiet nights at the firehouse, he tells the story of the white house that wouldn't burn, and the prayer that changed everything. The prayer that Maggie O'Brien used that night was Psalm 91, known as the prayer of protection. It begins, "He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God, in whom I trust." Mike Harrison learned that night that some fires can only be put out by faith.